Thank you guys for joining us on another episode of the Devoted Creators Podcast. Today, as always, we have a very special guest. So I'm very grateful to have him here. But for the purposes of our audience, could you please introduce yourself and tell us what you do?
Thank you for having me. My name is Inua Ellams II. I am primarily a writer, but I create various types of texts for various types of audiences. I'm an immigrant, a displaced person, which means that what governs a lot of my work are what being displaced causes, which is deep questions of identity, displacement itself, and destiny, about belonging on a micro and macro level. So those impulses drive me to create lots of poetry, lots of theatre and drama, lots of long-form essays, but also I curate live events for people to gather and just commune for one night only. And I try and create flat, egalitarian, democratic spaces where there isn't hierarchy, even among the panels, the panelists, the guests I invite. So in a nutshell, that's what I do.
In a nutshell.
In a nutshell.
I didn't know you were a second. Who was the first?
My father.
Okay.
Yeah, I have the exact same name as him.
Can you tell me a little bit about him?
Yes, he is currently in a care home because he had a couple of strokes.
Sorry to hear that.
A few years ago. Yeah, thank you very much. But his faculties are still there. He's still mischievous. He's still causing trouble in the care home. He's very opinionated. He's very funny. He's very charismatic. He worked in the import and export of Nigerian foods where we lived in Nigeria.
Oh.
He worked in shipping nationally, globally as well. He was Muslim initially, then converted to Christianity, which is my middle name is Mohammed, as he has. When we got confirmed, we both took on Mark as a middle name because we didn't want to change our initials.
Fair.
But I do not look like a Mark.
Not really.
So, no, I've always gone by Mohammed.
I'm John.
Yeah, exactly. No, but you're John without the H.
True.
Which makes it a little exotic.
A little bit more creative.
Yeah. And I'm Mark without a K.
Okay.
It's with a C.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah,
It
again.
feels more artistic.
Yes. But Mark Ellams?
I think it's a good name. Sounds like an actor.
Yeah.
How much did your father's, he sounds like a very industrious man, but also with some boldness. How did he influence you and what you do?
I think a lot of what influenced my father was being a Nigerian, which is to say, if you're born in a country where there isn't any sort of social security, any sort of societal safety net, it forces you to be constantly enterprising, which is the euphemism I'll use to describe the Nigerian attitude towards business.
Hustle culture.
Hustle culture, yeah. So my dad was always coming up with new legal ways, I should say, to make money. And I just saw him pushing hard to look after our family. So whenever I came across setbacks, I just thought I haven't answered the question well in order for the answer to be yes. And that just pushed me to always be creative, to creatively try and find ways over obstacles around roadblocks. So that sense of getting up, doing it yourself, of constantly trying to redefine the world and its answers probably drove me when I was young, when I was an artist. But the very first thing I remember doing was planning an entire city when I was 4 years old.
As you do.
As you do, as you do.
Okay, fair. And we're not talking Sims, we're talking like...
No, pencil and paper, drawing the whole thing.
Incredible.
And my father was really proud of me, and I'd surprised him. And I thought, I want to be able to surprise adults for the rest of my life. Yeah, so it came from that.
And you mentioned being displaced. Obviously, you grew up in Nigeria. At what point did you come to the UK? Can you say why?
Yeah, I came when I was 12, and I went to Holland Park, which is where we met. And I left because my father had traveled to Mecca for the pilgrimage. And when he was there in Mecca, running around the Kaaba, he saw a couple of things that didn't sit well with him and came back to Nigeria and was questioning aspects of his faith, which, if you actually study Islam, it deeply encourages, because so much of it is based on philosophy and critical thinking. But this was when Boko Haram, which famously kidnapped 264 girls, were just beginning to rise for the serpent of its head to rise above Nigeria and begin biting people. And my father was just one of the people who got stung by its venom.
Of course, if he's doing international shipping and business,
exactly,
it's going to stand out.
A man of his stature questioning belonging and faith just didn't sit well with them. So the midlife difficult for him and for us. There were a few attempts at his life, which and our life as a family, which made us escape. So we came here.
I'm glad you did.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
And how'd you end up at Holland Park?
We arrived and lived in my uncle's house in Victoria, and flat in Victoria, rather. 6 of us crammed into this 2-bedroom place. And we were trying to find schools, secondary schools to go to. But around that time in Victoria, there was nothing. So the closest school was Holland Park. So we applied and got places, yeah.
What can you tell me about that time?
What can I say? What can I tell you? Firstly, I thought I had a good understanding of England because I'd watched Rent a Ghost, and I'd watched, Educating Marmalade. I'd watched Some Mothers Do Have Them. I'd read my way through Enid Blyton novels, the racist and the less racist novels. So I thought, okay, I got this. I understand England. I arrived, and coming to Holland Park was the complete antithesis. I was like, firstly, why is the whole world in my class and they're all immigrants? So many Moroccans, so many Ethiopians, Iranians, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, then
Somalis.
Caribbean kids, Somali, all of that. I was like, this is not the Britain I read about in Charles Dickens. This is different. So that was the first huge culture shock. And then the second was discovering racism and not computing or making sense. That was really staggering.
Why did it not compute?
Because in all the stuff I read in Nigeria, they didn't really mention racism. And the concept was so foreign to me that because of the color of my skin, people would think I'd be less than them. It didn't correlate with the Britain I was taught to aspire towards. And it didn't make sense given the classroom that I was in. Yet, there it was. So it was just so confusing. And because in all the schools I'd been to, I'd been bullied. And
Was this in Nigeria?
In Nigeria, yeah. And I knew how to handle bullies. You sort of take the piss out of them and run away before they can hit you. Simple things.
You're small, but you're fast.
Exactly right. So I was used to getting taunted for things that I know how to respond towards. But being taunted about the color of my skin just confused me. That was a whole new... But also, I thought it was stupid. And I didn't have to combat the stupidness. Yeah. I was just so confused.
It's funny because I was born here, but I traveled to Ghana, where my grandmother's from quite a young age. But then going back as a slightly older child and a younger person, I started to realize that when I'm in Ghana, I don't feel black. I don't feel black. I'm not even aware, really.
Yeah.
Like, it just doesn't factor.
Yeah.
And it's, I guess, coming from a predominantly black country to a place which isn't, people will tell you. They'll let you know.
Yeah.
It just never really occurred to me until I went back to Ghana. I was like, oh yeah, I'm not black here. Yeah. I'm just John.
It's confusing, right? It's mad.
And how did that culture shock, how did that impact you then?
It made me really cherish people then who just liked me for who I was, who I could be completely myself with. It made me think that there are some people who can't even acknowledge me without having to look through various lenses and barriers and I don't know. So for those people who just liked me, I thought, he's skinny, he has glasses, but he makes me laugh. I'm going to hang out with him. Just made and then conversations deepened and friendships blossomed. So it made me really appreciate those people. And also, as soon as I left Holland Park, it made me really appreciate that school as well. For despite all of that, the safety bubble, the sense of community, the fact that most of us were poor, but the school allowed for that and really catered. They were so, quote unquote, woke. Before that word even existed, they were so far ahead of the rest of the country, and which makes me despair at what the school has become now, because it's complete the opposite now.
Yeah, it's been assimilated in a lot of ways. I think one of the things I really enjoyed about growing up in West London at that particular time, kind of the late 90s, early noughties, is how multicultural it was without it being it wasn't a tick box.
Yeah.
It wasn't done by someone saying we must have a school that has X amount of these people.
Yeah.
It was by circumstance. People grew up here and came here from various different places. There were sons and daughters of diplomats at our school, but then also sons and daughters of immigrants and refugees.
Yeah.
And I loved being part of a group of friends that included, you know, traveller children from an Irish community and immigrants from Nigeria and, you know, kids that are obsessed with football from Somalia and Morocco. Like all of my friends are from everywhere.
Yeah.
And it was like you said, it was quite a bubble. But then coming out of that world, it does make it seem silly when people are racist.
Yeah.
It's like, huh?
Yeah.
Because I know plenty of black guys that I can't stand. I don't give them a pass because they're black.
Exactly.
Like, they look like me, so they're cool.
Yeah.
No. You have to take someone on their merits.
It's one of the problems with when she, who shall not be named, she's the new Voldemort. When she made that comment, I'm talking about Kemi Badenoch, when she made that comment that integration has failed, I thought, by what parameters here?
And have you really tried?
Have you really tried? And because a lot of the people who are integrated, they don't even think about that. They just think, I'm just vibing with the person who lives next door to me. Is when you begin to throw this syllable words and begin to find yardsticks by which you measure success, that it becomes a problem, because it becomes introspective and intellectual, and that is where humanity goes to die. You know, so yeah, rose-tinted glasses, but truth, and just, you know, really regretting what's become. I'll give an example. Grenfell March. Last time I was here, I was marching silently. A guy says, "Excuse me, are you Inua Ellams?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "I teach at Holland Park." White boy, white dude. And I said, "Oh, thank you." Every time I have a theatre production on, I reach out to the school saying, "I can give you free tickets to my place. Bring a class, bring 3 classes, it's all good." And no one ever replies to my email. And he said, "Oh, I'm really sorry to hear that. I've been trying to teach your work in the class.
Wow.
It's great to hear that your alumni give me an email address and we'll do this." I said, "Great." Gave it to him. Again, no word.
Interesting.
And this was Grenfell right there.
Yeah.
So at least he had the presence of mind to think, as someone who teaches in West London, this community gathering is important to me, so I'm gonna come. But even then, there's the individual and the establishment, and something breaks there.
Yeah, that's fascinating. How did that time and the influence of your father, being an immigrant, obviously you've become a writer, but what point did you decide writing was going to be your avenue?
What point? I got into a lot of trouble at Holland Park School because I was an idiot. I was top of most of
Join
my...
the club.
Yeah, right. I was top of a lot of my classroom. I always scored well, but I just used to get into trouble because, you know, in Nigeria, when I act up in class, punishment was being caned by the teacher.
Literally beaten.
Literally beaten. And the thing is, I kind of liked it, not because I'm a masochist or anything like that.
Is that you?
Or I'm into BDSM.
Hey, no judgment. No judgment, man.
It's just because they added actual stakes to being a bad kid,
Fair.
right? There was cause
tangible.
and effect. It was tangible. When I came to Holland Park, punishment was detention
Stand outside.
with teachers who I liked. So I just thought, I get to hang out with you one-on-one basis after school. This is not a deterrent.
Free tutorial.
You know. So it was a very different experience for me. So I completely enjoyed school. Completely, no part of it was faulty for me. So I just really liked my teachers, including my English teacher. And she was the first person who, despite giving me various detentions, really saw that I was good at English. And she'd always say, you know, this is really good. And once she read my English homework to my entire classroom,
Oh, wow.
who got up and gave me a standing ovation.
That's like a movie moment.
Listen, right? And the girl I had a crush on ran across the class and gave me a hug.
Oh my God.
So I felt, okay.
This is ridiculous.
This is ridiculous, right? But I moved someone
Yeah, enough.
physically to come and show affection because of something that I wrote. And after that, I began to really think more about writing. But it was when I returned here from Ireland that because of immigration problems, it was illegal for me to work. And in order not to get into the kind of trouble black boys get into South London, in Peckham specifically, my mother insisted I go to the library each day. My father insisted the same thing. So I'd just be there reading. And the librarian sort of saw this skinny kid coming up with big ideas in his head, sitting down, reading all the time. So she began to suggest books that I should read. So slowly, my understanding of the world and my place in it and the reasons why I was here, why we left Nigeria, began to expand socio-politically. And along with that came an idea of aesthetics, how to put words together to communicate all of that confusion. So it just naturally went to writing poetry because I couldn't find an instrument I can teach myself to use. So, but pens and paper, simple things.
Got this.
So I started doing that and I just carried on. And by the time I could go to university, I'd published a book, a pamphlet. And my dad came to that reading and saw people older than he was queuing for my autograph.
Mad.
And that's when he began to think, okay, you don't have to go to uni anymore. Just keep writing and see what happens.
Interesting. Because I guess, did you experience the pressures from your parents of doing other things for a career?
Oh, definitely. They wanted me, to banker, accountant,
Doctor.
kind of things, doctor, all of those things.
Things they can tell the other family that we're proud of.
that they were proud of, yeah. But I think because they knew of our circumstance, they were firstly, I was going to say proud, but that's not the word. I think they accepted the fact and appreciated the fact that I was doing something productive. So they just asked me to keep on doing so. And then one thing led to another, and they finally let go of those things. But also, I couldn't go to university, so I used to sneak into the university I couldn't afford to go to because, like I said, I'm Nigerian, enterprising.
I'll find a way.
Yeah. And the university I used to sneak into gave me an honorary doctorate last year. So
Incredible.
I now have a PhD.
That's insane.
So my parents are like, all right, cool.
Fair.
Yeah.
I need to hear more about this. So what university was it?
University of the Arts.
Okay.
London,
And you were just showing up to classes?
Yeah. I befriended students who were there. They lived in Camberwell. So I just used to rock up and run into lectures with them.
Amazing.
And sit there taking notes.
Especially knowing as someone, I went to uni as a mature student.
Mm-hmm.
But knowing that people pay for those courses and don't go to class.
Yeah.
You were taking yourself to class.
Yeah, I was taking myself to class.
Don't tell me you were doing the work as well.
No, I mean, there was no one to
That's a bit
sign
much.
the essays, so yeah.
Fair.
But I was taking all the notes and doing my own bits of study later at night. What did you study at uni?
I did journalism and psychology.
Okay, nice.
Yeah, I wanted to be the Black Fraser Crane. So I thought that was the perfect combination.
There's still time.
Maybe, who knows? But yeah, it's funny because I never really considered journalism as a career until much later on, because I didn't even realize it was a proper job.
Yeah.
Like being able to write for a living. Like I love writing, but I never thought I could do this.
Yeah.
Because I didn't really know people got paid, which is maybe just ignorance. But
I don't think it's ignorance actually. I think it's what is around you growing up. There's a reason why most of the journalists are still white, Oxbridge educated males above 30 or whatever. And that is because they grow up surrounded by that, saying, if you're not active in the world, you can at least write about it. And if we know the power of writing with regards to colonization, then we know the systems through which they're educated, and that is taught to them as being of value. Whereas in most of our communities, we're busy living. We don't stop to write how we live.
Yeah.
So I think it's more that as opposed to, yeah.
And also I think certain cultures realized very early on, I'm talking hundreds of years ago, the value of being able to shape a story and the impact that has on society. And I think I say homogeneously black culture didn't realize that externally. We would tell stories within our cultures.
Yeah.
I'm Caribbean and African heritage, and Caribbean storytelling is, famous. It's just like African storytelling.
Yeah.
Various communities in Africa have storytelling as part of their culture, but it wasn't externally facing. This was how we teach our children values.
Yeah.
It wasn't how we tell the world about ourselves. And I think for whatever reason, our cultures never really grasped that until it feels like very recently, when people like yourself and other, I feel like very predominantly, I don't like the word woke, but very switched on individuals who are from, Black heritage are now telling those kind of stories from our perspective.
Yeah.
I think it's necessary.
It's so necessary, but it's also the value systems built into this, right? And what we value is different from what other cultures or people values, and if they don't find those things within our communities, then they devalue us. I know, for instance, in pre-colonial northern Nigeria, there were scripts written in Arabic, which was the alphabetical systems taught to those pre-colonial Nigerians, and they'd use Arabic alphabets to write their own stories down, bastardizing the language. But when the British came to colonize, they destroyed all of those things. 90% of them were wiped off the face of the earth because they didn't want us to remember our things. And then later on, they'd say there's no African literature. And African literature only begins when we say it begins because we wrote it down. So even systematically, they understood that.
The power of it.
The power of it, yeah.
I mean, because, I think even growing up, all the movies that tell you stories of those times, our cultures became civilized. Yeah. Civilization happened to us.
Yes.
Like literacy happened to us.
The pain of death. Yes.
Which is so kind of bonkers when you think about it.
It's so mad.
How does learning those things, learning about that history, how does that impact your work then? How has that impacted your work over time?
It's really complex because it forces me to question who my audience is. And this is what I mean. When I stumble across these things, which is proofs of literacy and literary culture that preceded Nigeria, for instance, I think, why don't I know this? And then I think, having discovered it, I need to tell everyone. But when I say this to Nigerians, they're like, oh yeah, we know that. And I said, why don't you write it? Oh, because we know that. We don't need to write it to prove to ourselves that we know it. And I think, okay, fine. If I'm writing this story for a Nigerian audience, they look at me with question marks, like, are you an idiot?
What's wrong with you?
What's wrong with you, right? But if I'm writing it for a British audience, then it makes sense. But then, why am I writing it for a British audience? Why am I centering them rather than the community I was born into? What does that mean? Am I doing my family's community a disservice by centering a British audience? Am I a sellout? Am I selling in? What am I selling into? Who am I voicing? Whose concerns are preeminent? And so I get into this loop, and it's really, really frustrating.
How do you process that? Because that sounds like a lot.
It's a lot, and I don't know. I think at some point, I try to think of who I can affect the most. And it's my nephews and nieces here who are, 12, between 5 and 12. And I think if I need to make England better and safer for them, maybe I should tell stories that they will enjoy, that will make their lives better. And that's how I try and square, that circle. Because if I try and write for a Nigerian audience, typically I'd fail because I no longer live in the country. My diction, my syntax has changed. If I write stories there as I speak now, they think this is a foreign, this is Oyinbo boy.
It's inauthentic in some ways.
So I think that's how I square it. I try and create a better world for my nephews and nieces.
Also, I've been to some of your events and I saw your barbershop show at the Roundhouse.
Barber Shop Chronicles, yeah.
Barber Shop Chronicles is amazing. And if you don't mind me saying, but also one of the things that I've noticed is the majority of your audience isn't Black, actually. And in a lot of ways, I wouldn't call that, for me, you don't get to choose who likes or connects with your work. So you couldn't sell out in that sense.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah.
But also, people want to know about things they don't know about. Like you said, your Nigerian people you might have had those conversations with, they're like, duh. Yeah. So you can't necessarily educate or inspire them in the same way as you can with someone who has no idea and no connection to those stories. And, learning about your experiences or your perspective, or, you know, women go to see Barber Shop Chronicles.
Yeah.
But those stories are very, very specifically and centered on a man's experience, a black man's experience in a black barbershop.
Yeah.
If you went to a Turkish barbershop, it might be similar stories, but there will be different stories,
Yeah.
different perspectives. I think people are still getting a lot out of it when they're completely removed from the direct context. And there has to be value in that, I think.
I think you're absolutely right. There is a lot of value in that. But what that does is that it makes the process of writing even more laborious and more of a puzzle, but ultimately more enjoyable. And by that I mean, there are 4 layers of storytelling minimum in whatever it is that I write. My last play at the National Theatre was called Three Sisters. It was about the Nigerian Civil War. And I wrote jokes that I knew Nigerians who were Igbo would understand, Nigerians would understand, British Nigerians would understand, Africans would understand, than just the wider audience. And sometimes I'd be sitting in the audience, and by how hard the audience laughed, I knew who was sitting where. So that's that sort of spider sense.
Like spatial audio.
Yeah, you know. But the thing is, I'm aware of that, and I write into it. This is why it takes me roughly 7 years to write a play, because there's just layers.
That's fascinating. Where do you start with writing a play? What is the starting point?
I think most of my plays are failed poems, which is to say, I usually begin by trying to write a poem, and most of the time I satisfy that need to create, and it's finished, it's maybe this length on a sheet of paper, I'm good. But now and then, the poem hasn't quite fed the itch, and then it becomes a sequence of poems, and then it stops. And then maybe it's a book length of, 50 poems in a book, and then. But sometimes if the idea is too big, it becomes a voice that I'm constantly arguing with. And that slowly becomes a character, which is maybe older than me or younger than me, or the British version of me rather than the Nigerian British version of me. And then we begin to disagree about a subject. And then it becomes a series of debates. How can I get them to agree with me? Have I succeeded? Have I failed? What would they need to say to change my mind the next time I meet them? And then it becomes a series of scenes, which becomes a play. So usually that's how things begin. It slowly gets bigger and bigger.
As a failed poem.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean, so you mentioned there the need to create. Where do you think that comes from?
For me, mental health and well-being. For me, an attempt to control the uncontrollable, an attempt to bear witness. I think it's all of those things. When you're 12 years old and the country you're born into tries to kill you, that creates a problem. You leave, you come to England, and for various reasons, you have to leave. That creates a problem. You go to Ireland, you live there for 3 years, then Ireland tries to kill you. That creates another problem. So you're just constantly running and there's chaos everywhere. So the attempt to create is to control the chaos, right? There's this saying that the world is chaos. The job of the writer is to impose order, which is a fiction, and you have to acknowledge that. Otherwise, it's a thankless job. You will always fail. So I think it's to do with an attempt to control. And because of the chaos and the anxiety of all of that stuff, writing then, the illusion of control is cathartic. So I think my impulse to create comes from all of that.
And I guess what would you... Because one of the things I've noticed when I look at art, and even when I think about things that I make, there's consistent threads throughout. What I feel like I'm realizing over time is that we all have a story to tell. And we're just finding various ways to look at it from different perspectives. It feels like.
Yeah.
What would you say your story or stories seem or seem to be to you at this point?
I think I'm still drawn to people trying to make sense of the environment they find themselves in whilst the environment is disintegrating. It's an attempt to hold on, it's to grasp the ocean with the hand. I think most of my stories boils down to that and what happens when you fail at doing that. I don't really write stories with happy endings because I think it's false. There's this joke about life, which is, nobody gets out alive. Eventually
Dark.
it claims you. It's so dark, right? But it's true. So I always write. There is a lot of joy in the things that I write because I write about characters who find ways to inject happiness into the bleakest of situations. But I wouldn't say there's a happy ending. Most of the time there is an acceptance, and that is a triumph of sorts.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I hadn't even thought about it because when I look at the stuff that I've seen of yours, it's almost a rebellion against the expected outcome. Do you ever have in your head the kind of Hollywood and everything worked out?
Absolutely.
In your head, and you go, nah, screw that.
Absolutely.
How do you do that? Do you where are you leaning towards when those things are coming up?
I try to tell the poetic truth. Okay, I wrote this epic play called The Half-God of Rainfall, where who we think the protagonist, because it kind of switches halfway, is a kid loosely based on me. And at the end, he rises up and fights Zeus, the Greek all-father, and then kills Zeus because Zeus is a sexual predator. And the first draft, that was how it ended because I imagined myself being a force of good in the world, and I wanted the kid to carry on that tradition of goodness, and therefore he would go on to vanquish the big bad. It was also the huge Hollywood ending. So I remember sharing the story with script consultants of mine, most of them women, some of whom were victims of sexual abuse themselves. And they said, Inua, this wouldn't happen in real life. And I said, what do you mean? They said, because time after time, when this happens, men protect men. So this wouldn't happen. He wouldn't fight Zeus and defeat Zeus. He'd probably join Zeus. And initially I disagreed, saying, no, I can't tell that story. That's just dark. That's messed up. No. But then they said, okay, read these articles. And I began to study, and they were absolutely right. Time after time, they're lawyers who find a technicality and get the guy off. The guy get away scot-free. He pays hush money. Look at Donald Trump, And then I had to completely try, even though this was an epic poem, it was fantasy, there are tenets of reality that underpin the story, and I needed to use that to make the story work on a metaphoric level, allegorical level, and a real level, which meant that I needed to remove the guy and remove that ending. So I completely changed the ending, and that isn't how it ends anymore.
How did it end?
He dies. Zeus kills him for fighting against him, and his mother rises to end up fighting and battling Zeus. Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's a really interesting account of how feedback helps and shapes your work.
Yeah.
Could you share some more experiences like that? Because I think that's something that maybe I don't do enough in terms of seeking feedback and responding to it. Because it could have been quite easy for you to be quite defensive there.
Yeah.
And gone, hang on, it's a very personal story because you centered this character slightly on yourself.
Yeah.
And then you could have taken that and been, no, you guys are wrong. This is the story that I want. How have you come to decide that seeking that kind of feedback was useful? And how have you dealt with it that you don't get defensive?
Thank you. That's a good question. I think I don't want to say I'm humble because I think there's an arrogance in saying that.
I'm so humble.
So, yeah.
I'm the most humble person.
Yeah. It's not that. It's just that I know I don't have all the answers. I know that on a fundamental level because I have a twin sister and the way she navigates the world is so different to mine. even though we were born within 10 minutes of each other. We've lived in the same house for most of our lives. We grew up reading the same books. We gossiped. We argued similarly. But the world has changed her by how it treats her. And it's changed me by how it treats me. And I can't think the way I view the world is right, because her existence is as legitimate as mine. And I know that on a fundamental level. So I can't then assume what I think is true, because I also know it isn't. And also, I'm from we're saying just before we began speaking, I'm from a country of 500 languages. And I know that knowledge is coded into language. And because I don't speak any of those languages, I know there are 500 ways of being in the country I was born into that I'm not privy to. So it's arrogant of me to think my Nigeria is their Nigeria, and that's just one country. And there are over 150 countries in the world?
Yeah.
So I know I just have a small piece of the puzzle, and I can't use that to determine the rest of the pie. That's ridiculous. It's arrogant. So I seek feedback to cover my ass. So if I create something, it reaches the widest possible audience and is as true as it's possible to be true.
And truth matters to you?
Yes.
Why?
I mean, that's such a fundamentally, they say the simplest questions are the hardest to answer. Why does truth matter to me? Because lying is hard. Because it requires so much brain power. And if I want to lie as well as I tell the truth, I'll need to do it on an encyclopedic level. And I don't have time for that. I don't have time for that. I can't keep track of lying because it's hard. If you do it well, it's hard. And I can't. The world is so fundamentally rich, and the truth opens doors to so much complexity. And even by the way you arrange and structure complexity, you can suggest lies if you want to do so. But there's just so much joy in arranging facts, let alone lying. Lying is boring. There's no point, and telling the truth is hard enough.
I think also on a fundamental level, truth feels good.
It does.
And in the way that being a child and telling a lie and getting away with it can have a sense of feeling good. It still isn't the same as being true to yourself and to the things you believe. And the way that feels, it's a different kind of happiness. It's almost a fulfilling, complete happiness rather than I've got one over on you. Yeah. That's very fleeting joy. Whereas truth is a lasting joy for me.
And it's so freeing. It's just, my girlfriend often beefs with me that I'm too honest. And by that I mean, I just don't have time. I'll just say things that are on my chest. And sometimes she says, I wish you could soften that a little bit.
Like, babe, not those jeans.
Yeah. And I think
that colour, not for you.
Yeah, we were getting ready to go. And I said, I'm not sure about that. And she thought I was being deeply critical. And I said, no. There are other things. I love half of your wardrobe. I just don't think those things work. And it took a while to realize I wasn't being insulting. I was just saying...
Sharing some feedback.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she was defensive.
Yeah.
Why do you think your work has connected with people? Because it's one thing to become a writer. And, I know loads of people that claim to be writers and they have day jobs and they don't really make a living from writing. How do you think you've managed to translate having a passion and a talent for writing into a career that is sustainable?
I think in hip hop, especially from America, there's this saying of rhyming for rent. I started out doing that. Literally, I'd go and read poetry. They'd give me £15 cash in hand, and I'd take that back home and I'd throw that into the rent. Which is to say, writing was never luxury. It was a necessity. And because of that, I had no other choice but to do it. So the passion and the difficulty of my childhood meant that I could only do this thing. It was the only thing legal that I could do. Therefore, and because I had to do it to live, it was all I could do. So I just pursued doing it and doing it and doing it until, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years had passed. And because I write so broadly, I was constantly producing other types of texts, which meant that it lived beyond me. I was creating work for actors. So when I was writing a poem, the play would still be touring. I was creating blog posts and essays which could be read and shared without me having to be present. So it meant my output could grow and I didn't have to be the delivery mechanism of my own work. But also just being relentless of collaborating with people, making mistakes, owning your mistakes publicly, teaching with your mistakes, and not being too precious. And the difficulty is pressure is required to create poetry specifically. So it's like riding a bicycle. You have to learn how to balance in order to move. You have to move in order to balance.
And you have to risk falling to get on a bike.
All constantly. Yeah.
You mentioned mistakes.
Yeah.
What are some of the mistakes you've made that you can share?
God.
And what are the lessons?
My second play.
How long do we have?
I know, right? They're just so many. But my second play is one. It was a one-person play in the round, which you're not really supposed to do, because if a play is in a round, then you have an audience 360, and usually you need someone to be able to look in at one half of the audience when you're looking at the audience. You need two people in order to make that work. So there's constantly something to see. So this
Otherwise,
was one
people just staring at the back of your head.
So this was me doing one play in the round, which meant I was constantly spinning, trying to make sure I was giving them a little bit to myself. But also, it was a play of which 70% was set in Nigeria. It was about this drummer in the middle of a village. And the second half, the 30% or so, was set, of the narrative was set here in the UK. And what happened was I'd created such a vital life in village Nigeria that coming to cold London couldn't create the same relationship, affinity, joy with the audience. So emotionally, they just kind of shut down. And I realized structurally that didn't serve them. It didn't serve the story. It didn't create the excitement, the charge you need when driving towards the end of a story. So and that was a lesson I learned publicly, right? Because that play failed. And I'm really hoping someone gives me the opportunity to rewrite it, because I tell the story in a very different way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can imagine how at the time, I guess before you launched it, you wouldn't have known that was going to fail.
No.
How did the impact of that failure affect you?
One, I was grateful for those who let me fail, because those are things you learn from. If people warn, again, so Nigerian, people tell me not to do something, just makes me want to do it even more. So I was glad that all of that happened and I failed and I learned from it. But also, it really had me go back to the fundamentals of theatre writing, what it means to engage with the audience on a live basis, ways to structure stories so it is constantly exciting. It made me even deconstruct cinema and film as if it was a play, to really look at different narrative structures and how to apply that. It just made me more intensely structured and critical, which is why before I start writing a play, I just think about the ways in which I'm thinking about writing it before I even start writing. I just make sure formulaic, structurally, language on a language level, it all checks out before I then choose how the characters on stage are telling the story. I start from here rather than the first page.
And then obviously you have to think about delivery. What theatres do we use?
Exactly. Who will come to the theatre and be sitting in the audience? How does that sit in the theatre's body of work? You know, all of those things.
You mentioned the film and TV theatre. I'd love to know which films, TV influences you have and kind of what has shaped your creative instincts.
How much time do you have?
Loads. No time limit. We've got at least 4 hours on that camera. So
I'd say Memento by Christopher Nolan.
yes.
First time I saw that.
I mean, everything Christopher Nolan does blows my mind.
Yeah, everything. But
What was it about Memento?
firstly, he plays around with time. He always does this in all of his things, but that was the first time I'd seen it on such a micro level. And there's this saying about how lots of African literature also plays around with time, and it's definitely something that the more I look at my work, I think, oh yeah, you're fucking around with time as well. And there's so many reasons. We know, for instance, in the West, time was constructed because of capitalism. Time zones were created to make sure people would arrive to get on steamships and train, blah, 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 blah.
Farming and all of that.
Exactly. Whereas in lots of rural African communities, you'd wake up when the sun rose, you'd go and farm, you'd stop because it's too hot. And people would say, I'll see you in the afternoon. And that just meant when it was cool enough to wake up in the morning. You know, time didn't work that way. So time was sort of a surreal notion. We knew it was there, we didn't really fuck with it. And I think, so on an African level, I really appreciate Christopher Nolan just messing around with time in all of his stories. That's just tick my Nigerian funny bones. But in Memento specifically, the structure is like this. Then there's video of Christopher Nolan explaining this with a chalkboard, where time doesn't go chronologically, it bends. So half of the story he tells it in black and white, and the second is color. And they meet in the middle and then loop back on each other. And it just blew my mind. It was mind-bending. So I loved that. So when I start telling stories, I think about time. How do the characters experience time? What does it mean to them? If they're Nigerian, if they're African, if they're Africans who were educated here and vice versa, what other points of contention? How do these things create suspense and conflict between characters? So the time base is just Christopher Nolan's work. And I know lots of Black filmmakers and writers talk about this, but Moonlight was really beautiful because of the simplicity of the storytelling, the emotional underpinnings of it, how well charged it was. But also, I'd never so clearly seen storytelling that used color and the color palette as one of the languages. Again, it was just so deft and so beautiful. And I know this was experimented with in The Matrix. If we talk about the world as Neo experienced it, was the world of the Matrix itself that was sort of green, sort of bleached, and sort of high contrast. So it did similar things to talk about the sensorial experience of being alive versus an artificial one. But Moonlight did so on a Black level, which meant that I appreciated it on another, so I think a lot about color palettes. And in poetry, I think about how that helps convey mood and emotion so that there's something else on a subconscious level the readers of my poetry are tapping into. So I think about all of those things when I'm writing.
What other TV, film? I want all the influences, all the references. Key ones. I mean, you talk about hip hop quite a lot. I've noticed that. I mean, you always have been quite a hip hop head.
Yeah.
How has hip hop influenced your writing? And why didn't you become a rapper?
Wait, I want to give you one more film thing that has really, really inspired me. This is naff, but I just love it. The Lord of the Rings trilogy. I've always been a fan of fantasy, so I could go into Star Trek, I could go into Star Wars, but I want to talk about the Cultural Revolution the Lord of the Rings was for me. Because when I lived in Ireland, especially when I was deep into hip hop and basketball, a guy came over to me saying, I heard you like Star Trek and fantasy, sci-fi. You should read The Lord of the Rings. And I looked at the book and there was a sword on the cover.
Yeah,
so I just laughed at his face. I'm like, no, are you kidding me? I want to be with Nas and, Illmatic. That's the world. No, fuck this. And then the first movie came out. And on a whim, I went to see it. So I was sitting there in the audience. Comes up, they have Enya singing. There's just Middle Earth expanding. There's Frodo, there's Bilbo in the Shire. And something got me I don't even understand it. Maybe because I was a barefooted, dusty-foot philosopher running around in Nigeria when I was a kid, visiting my grandparents in the village. On some level, I thought, ooh, my body remembered that sensation. And then I finished the first movie and thought, I want all of this. I just read everything. But understanding the translations, the considerations of that, the feat of trying to condense thousands of years of history into, 9 hours of film. People even think that's long. If you read all of them, if you read the Silmarillion, the collection of short stories that preceded the actions of Lord of the Rings, if you read The Hobbit, you understand just what Jackson did in creating those stories. So, but the micro versus the macro, the ability to zoom in with the world falling apart. And there's just this 4'0" dude with a necklace having this immense task before him. That sense of scale really spoke to the epic kid I was, who by the time he was 15 had said goodbye to 3 countries and 3 nations. And felt his world disintegrate. I just connected with Frodo on a base level, So yeah, I keep on. I love Lord of the Rings.
I think in some ways as well that comes back to the thing I was saying about things that are true.
Yeah.
That was very true for you.
Yeah.
Seeing him on screen and learning his story.
Yeah.
Obviously it's fantasy, but some things do just resonate because they speak to something in us.
So fundamental in it, yeah.
And I think maybe would that be why hip hop has always been a thing for you then?
Because as we know, rappers are also fantasists. They also find ways to create these huge allegorical, metaphorical stories about their very harsh realities often. And the reason why I listened to hip hop was to understand how I might have been reconfigured in another world, in another lifetime, if I didn't grow up reading classic poetry in schools, if I didn't instantly become my teacher's nerds, my teacher's pets, and the nerd in my classroom that probably have ended up rhyming and trying to smash words together to create fire like the rappers did. But also, there's something about the swagger of rappers that feels very Nigerian, where you have nothing in your bank account, but you're pretending you have the whole world.
Yeah.
And all you have are your lyrics, are your words, the stories you can weave, the oral traditions we both talked about coming from. I just really spoke to me, And initially, I hated hip hop, especially when I was in Holland Park. And, I arrived in 1996, the year Tupac died. And in school, there were lots of hip hop heads.
That's when the score came out as well, Fugees.
Yeah, exactly right. And there were kids who were just sad about Tupac. And I was like, what is that? You don't know this motherfucker? Why are you worried about it? What's he done for you? But I remember I was in YCTV, which is this youth.
Yeah, Barbie Road.
Yeah, Barbie Road. And I was working with a friend of ours called Jack. And Jack was on his phone talking. And someone ran past and grabbed his phone from his hand and just disappeared. And suddenly a line from Tupac's Changes popped into head. And it goes, don't let them jack you up and pimp smack you up. They get jealous when they see you with your mobile phone. And as soon as Jack's phone was jacked from his hand, I remember thinking, oh yeah, he stole the phone because he's jealous because he doesn't have, oh my God, Tupac, what? And suddenly I went home to listen to Changes and the lyrics. And suddenly I thought, oh, wow. Truth. Exactly. And that's when I began to listen to hip hop. Then I moved to Dublin. I was playing a lot of basketball and all of them were listening to hip hop, so I had to listen to hip hop. And my poetry teacher was also my basketball coach. which meant that when he was teaching us to dissect poetry, I was taking those teachings directly to the basketball court because it was the same person teaching me basketball drill. So everything was just happening at the same time. And that's when my appreciation for lyricism, for narrative, for storytelling from a Western Black point of view really came to the fore.
I'd love to know what some of those parallels were then between, because having a basketball coach is also your poetry coach is quite unique.
Very
What were some of
unique,
those parallel lessons or things that he shared?
He was trying to teach us the beauty in a perfect line of sentence in a poem, where there isn't fat on the line. Everything you need to do is contained there. Everything you need to communicate is there. Just precision, the cleanliness of the line. And the same thing he'd ask us doing in basketball drills. When you do a crossover, make sure you limit your movements. Make sure you don't take too many steps, right? Make sure your arms aren't too big because someone might tap your arm and then it's a foul, but you lose the ball and then your whole team, they pay for that. It was just about the cleanliness, the fluidity of movement, but also working as a team. There are 5 different things you should also always consider when constructing a good poem, a good verse. And there are 5 members on the basketball team. You have to have the same clear vision in order to work effectively. So I was just applying all of those things in real time.
How do you work through creative blocks?
My main problem is time. I don't have time to do all the things that I want to. I don't really have creative blocks because I don't rely on my own intellect as the source of creativity. I constantly steal from the world because the world is vomiting creations at you. I steal narrative structures from podcasts. I steal philosophies and different ways of constructing narrative from other cultures who don't speak in English, who have other ways of constructing logic. If I only think of logic in a Western lens, then I'll have roadblocks.
You're limited.
I'm limited, but I don't do that. So I borrow from here, I do from here. It's just time to read and then I figure it out. But also, usually when I'm working on a TV script or working on a play, I figure out the problem of a poem in the background, my subconscious takes over. So I just hop from thing to thing. I don't really have creative block. I just don't have time.
It's a good lesson. I struggle with time in particular.
Yeah.
What do you find difficult then as a creative professional? Because there's so many elements to what we do now. It's not enough for me to be a photographer and a videographer and an editor and a writer. I also have to be able to market myself. I also have to be able to build a website. I also have to be able to do public speaking. Yeah. There's so much more to it. So you started with what you do, which is writing and events. Yeah. But there's so much more to that.
Yeah.
Well, what from that do you struggle with?
I struggle with networking. I don't really know how to network. Back in the day, my address book on my Mac would crash because of how many phone numbers and email addresses I had. And it's still huge. But when you have to sit down and say, okay, I know that person, bring them together. I don't know how to do so because there's something feels too Machiavellian about that. I don't really know how. And I'd rather still be in the fairyland creating and coming up with lineups and putting writers together. But thinking about networks and structural stuff, I'm really not. I'm not really good at that, which is why I'm trying to hire a manager to do some stuff. I think that's the main thing that I struggle with is networking. And because, I don't know, there's something that feels too close to nepotism in that. And I really believe in happenstance, where I created an environment and there's a structure that works, and I put artists in that structure and just let them be themselves. Yeah. And I trust that will work, as opposed to,
I mean, it definitely does work when you do that. But then also, does it not concern you then, if you see the value in what you do? Yeah. Does it not concern you that without acquiring and magnifying your audience, a lot of people are missing out on the value that your experiences can give?
It does, and I understand that on a fundamental level, because a lot of my friends and collaborators said the same thing. If you're able to maximize this, market this more, I think all of these people will find time to come to your events. And I don't have time to do it, and I don't yet have enough funds to pay for someone to do all of that stuff. I'm still searching for that. I really need someone to do all my social media because I really I don't have time to do so. I need someone to sit down with me with my address book and say, 10 of these people, if you put them together in a room and tell them to give this amount of money, I'm pretty sure they'll be able to happen. There's a part of me that feels weird about asking people for money or for help, even though
it's hard.
It's hard.
Asking for help is difficult.
It's really difficult. So those are my difficulties, and also I find it hard to value my work and what I've contributed, and part of it is to do with what it means to be a poet. And this is what I mean. Sometimes you're told, take time out, do a retrospective, appreciate yourself. But in poetry, you're only as good as the last poem you wrote, which means that you are your own measuring stick. And I always fall short because I never complete a poem. I just abandon it when I'm tired of pushing around punctuation. So the work is never done. Therefore, I never feel like I've done enough to stop working. If I'm still trying to write the best poem that I've ever written, I'm still running towards the horizon, hoping to meet the finishing line. And there never
that's
is
moving.
one. It's constantly moving. Yeah.
There's a couple of things I want to ask before we wrap up. One of them, though, is where do you see your work evolving to? Because, it started out as literally you showing up, like you said, doing some spoken word, and now it became a book and a series of books and plays. Yeah. Where do you see that work evolving to next? Where would you like it to even?
I definitely want to write a TV series. I haven't done that yet. I've been trying to for a few years. And a feature film. So I think those are the next things.
I'd love to watch a film by you. It'd be brilliant.
Yeah.
No pressure.
No pressure. No pressure. I have ideas.
What kind of themes are you kind of thinking on?
I want to turn a lot of my plays into feature films or TV series. But I have a massive, massive idea for huge sci-fi / mythological story about climate change. It's sci-fi, so climate change science fiction, but rooted in African mythology specifically. No one is going to give me money to do that just yet. I'm still,
sounds like a very big idea.
It's huge, but it's fun, it's exciting, it's universal, it's cross-cultural, it's multicultural, it's everything we've talked about. It's just epic. One day, yeah. And
I'm sorry to spring this on you. And we've never done this before, but given who you are and what you do, would you mind giving us something real short that you could recite?
Oh, from memory?
Just from memory. So it doesn't have to be long. I want to give people a feel for your words, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay. From memory. These days I hardly remember poems. Okay, let me see if I can remember this. This is from a poem called Class Zero, which is set in Ireland the day the Twin Towers fell. Double class after lunch is maths lesson. I walk in impeccably dressed in uniform, till James Cannon, my best friend, whose wit is swift as comets. James announces to the class, he says Inua has a minus area. That is the mathematical term for a black hole. I jump over the table, grab James on the headlock, grind my knuckles into the crown of his skull till his knees buckled. He screams, calling others into our mock scuffle, and the class becomes this mass fray where small fists like soft rubble rain on the buildings of our bodies. Limbs like exposed metal beams twist under the dust cloud of voices, below upwards and outwards continuously. To the maths teacher solidly there, pissed, calls for order. Dust settles. In the debris of torn shirts and upturned chairs, she demands to know the culprit of the fray. But in the calamity just past, we have grown together like a family of dust boys, so no one calls my name. She shrugs and tells us how 10 minutes ago 2 planes were flown into the World Trade Center, calls it America's worst nightmare, and sinks into a silence we take for despair. But we return her mood with blank stares. We are 16. All we care of beyond these 4 walls are Pamela Anderson, Snoop Dogg, and a Tig-Love taste bud with a pint of Guinness. With no frame of reference, this is new. We leave school, puzzled, into the living room, find my father huddled around the television. Mother paces back and forth. The atmosphere is horror, laced with disbelief. I sit cross-legged towards the TV screen and lean into the footage played over again where 2 planes crash into buildings. Instant rubble rains off the metal beams, twist under the dust clouds and fire, below upwards and outwards continuously till the buildings suddenly fall. Dust settles. In the debris of torn lives and upturned worlds, the newsreader calls for the culprit of the fray, but pauses to say how from ground zero, New York spawned a new race of people, survivors of the day, concrete powdered to one tone of grey. Years pass. I date a girl called Sarah and ask what she did as the towers fell. When she tells me it was her birthday, she blew out her candles as the fire swelled, the most muddled day she had been through. I replied, yeah, me too. Yeah.
Damn, dude.
Wow, I'm surprised I remembered that. Yeah. Sorry for that.
That was
Yeah.
Dude. See, this is why I love what you do.
Thank you.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Wow. Where can people see more of you and keep up with what you do?
Thank you. I have a website, Inua which is INUAELLAMS, Inua I also use Instagram, same thing at Inua Ellams, Threads at Inua Ellams as well.
Blue Sky?
No.
Not yet.
I don't really use Blue Sky or what's the other one called? Starts with M?
I don't know.
Mazont or something like Mastodon. Yeah. So it's just Threads and Instagram. I have an on TikTok, but I haven't posted anything. I just took it so no one takes it.
Fair.
Yeah.
I did the same on Blue Sky.
Yeah, oh, really? Yeah.
It's the new Twitter, apparently.
It is, but Threads does the same thing.
True.
Like, there are more people on Threads than on Blue Sky.
Fair.
Yeah.
Fair. Well, thank you so much for coming in.
Thanks for having
I really
me.
appreciate
Thank
you.
This has been dope.
Thank you guys for listening and watching if you're watching. If you have any comments or questions, please put them in the relevant section. If you know anyone who might connect with this episode, I hope you do as much as I have. Please share, tell a friend. I will see you guys in another video. Please hit subscribe.
Thanks, bro.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Appreciate you, man.
This was cool. This
That
was
was
good.
dope.
Yeah.